It was a warm, quiet Memorial Day weekend in rural Alabama when Susan Osborne and her 15-year-old son, Evan, mysteriously vanished. To their friends and family, Susan's life had seemed picture-perfect. She had recently remarried Jerry Osborne, an Air Force veteran who appeared to be the ideal husband and stepfather. But just beneath the surface of their seemingly happy home, a far darker reality was brewing. One that would soon unfold into a chilling mystery of deception and betrayal. Welcome to True Crime Series, where we delve deep into some of the most harrowing and mysterious cases. Today, we unravel the story of a mother and son who disappeared without a trace, leading investigators into a maze of dark secrets hidden by the very man who was supposed to protect them. Could Susan's discovery of Jerry's shocking double life have been the catalyst for their disappearance? And why did Jerry remodel their home and burn furniture shortly after they vanished? Join us as we explore this haunting case, revealing disturbing evidence and asking the question, what really happened to Susan and Evan Osborne? At the center of this story was Jerry Osborne, an Air Force veteran who had married Susan and assumed the role of Evan's stepfather. From the outside looking in, Jerry seemed like a devoted husband and father, providing Susan and Evan with a stable, comfortable life. He appeared to be the answer to Susan's prayers after her difficult divorce from Evan's father. She had finally found the stability she craved for her and her son, or so it seemed. But behind closed doors, there was much more to Jerry Osborne than anyone could have imagined. When Susan met Jerry, she believed she had found a man who would give her the life she had always dreamed of. After enduring a painful divorce from Evan's father, Susan was left trying to pick up the pieces. She had always been a devoted mother, doing her best to provide for Evan despite the emotional and financial struggles she faced. Then came Jerry Osborne, seemingly the perfect match. A handsome and disciplined Air Force veteran, Jerry represented safety and security. He was charismatic and charming, winning over both Susan and Evan quickly. For Susan, Jerry was more than just a romantic partner. He was the chance to build a family again, to give Evan the stability he needed, and to rebuild her own life after the turmoil of her past. They married not long after meeting, and Jerry took on the role of stepfather with apparent dedication. He provided for Susan and Evan financially, buying them a nice home and giving Susan the opportunity to quit her job so she could focus on being a full-time wife and mother. It seemed like everything was falling into place. But as the months passed, cracks began to appear in the facade of the perfect life they were building. From the outside, Jerry continued to present himself as the doting husband and father. He was protective of Susan and Evan, always ensuring they had what they needed. But Linda Anlum, Susan's mother, noticed something troubling about Jerry when she visited them on Mother's Day just weeks before her daughter and grandson disappeared. During her visit, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jerry, who had once been warm and welcoming, seemed distant and aloof. Susan hadn't said anything directly to her mother about problems with Jerry, but Linda sensed that there was tension in the air. Susan, always protective of her privacy, hadn't shared much about her personal life since marrying Jerry. Linda didn't want to push her daughter, but she couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right. Mother's Day came and went, and Linda returned to her home in Texas. But the nagging feeling that something was wrong persisted. Linda continued to text and call Susan regularly, as she always had. Susan was usually quick to respond, and they often kept in touch throughout the week. But in the weeks following her visit, Susan's responses became sporadic. Eventually, the communication stopped altogether. Linda sent text after text, growing increasingly worried as the days passed. Susan's silence was out of character. She had never gone more than a day or two without responding, and Linda's concern began to mount. After several days of silence, Linda joked in her final text, "Susie, if you don't answer, I'll have to come to Alabama and find you myself." But Susan didn't reply. Linda considered calling the police but hesitated, fearing she might overstep. Susan had always been very private, and Linda didn't want to upset her by involving the authorities. She even sent a letter, hoping that if something was wrong, Susan might reach out. But the letter came back, marked undeliverable. That was the final straw for Linda. A sense of dread washed over her, and she knew something was terribly wrong. She finally contacted the Elmore County Sheriff's Department to request a welfare check on her daughter. When deputies arrived at the home, Susan shared with Jerry. They found him there alone, cleaning the house. It wasn't unusual for someone to clean their home, but the intensity with which Jerry was scrubbing raised some eyebrows. The smell of bleach filled the air, and it seemed as though Jerry had been working on a deep cleaning project for days. When asked about Susan and Evan's whereabouts, Jerry claimed that they had left him on Memorial Day. According to Jerry, Susan had run off with another man, taking Evan with her. He told deputies that a mysterious man had picked up Susan and Evan from the house, and that they hadn't returned. Jerry even claimed that Susan had come back the following day to collect some furniture and other belongings, but that was the last time he had seen them. To bolster his story, Jerry presented a medical bill for Evan, showing that he had missed a dental appointment in the days after they allegedly left. He suggested that this proved they were still alive and simply chose not to come home. But the deputies weren't convinced. Something about Jerry's story didn't sit right with them. Why hadn't he reported them missing? Why hadn't Susan told anyone she was leaving? And why was Jerry so focused on cleaning, especially after his wife and stepson had supposedly walked out of his life? The inconsistencies in Jerry's story, combined with his unusual behavior, raised red flags for investigators. They returned to the house the following day with a search warrant, hoping to uncover more information about what had really happened. As detectives conducted their search, they were struck by the transformation of the house. In the 2 months since Susan and Evan had disappeared, Jerry had completely remodeled the interior. Hardwood floors had been torn up, carpets had been replaced, and the walls had been freshly painted. It was as though Jerry had tried to erase all traces of the family's life inside the home. Neighbors confirmed that Jerry had been burning old furniture in his backyard during the weeks following Susan and Evan's disappearance. They recalled thick smoke rising from the yard, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning plastic. The neighbors were accustomed to seeing Jerry's fires, but the frequency and intensity of the burnings during that time stood out to them. Investigators were growing increasingly suspicious. Why would Jerry go through such lengths to remodel the house so thoroughly? Was he trying to cover something up? To answer these questions, detectives brought in a powerful forensic tool, luminol, a chemical that can detect traces of blood even after it's been cleaned. They sprayed luminol in several areas of the house, and what they uncovered sent chills down their spines. The luminol revealed multiple areas where blood had been spilled and then cleaned. The kitchen, laundry room, and guest bathroom all showed signs of blood. This wasn't the kind of blood one might expect from a small injury. This was evidence of something far more violent. As investigators continued their search for answers, they turned to Holly Hatfield, Susan's best friend. Holly had recently moved to South Florida, but had kept in close contact with Susan through email. In fact, Susan had confided in Holly about deeply troubling things she had discovered about Jerry. In a series of emails sent over the course of a year, Susan revealed the dark secrets she had uncovered about her husband. According to Susan, Jerry wasn't the man he pretended to be. She had found evidence that Jerry was living a double life. He had been engaging in secret affairs with other men, and Susan had even discovered an online profile where Jerry had advertised himself as a male escort. Susan's emails to Holly painted a disturbing picture. Jerry had become increasingly controlling and paranoid. He monitored Susan's phone calls and text messages, and she had to resort to using email to communicate with Holly. Susan told Holly that she was afraid of Jerry, and she confided that she was planning to leave him, but she had to be careful. She needed to secure a job and health insurance for Evan before she could make her escape. Despite the mounting evidence, Susan hadn't told Jerry everything she knew. She had confronted him about some of his infidelities, but she kept her full knowledge of his secret life hidden, fearing how he might react if he knew the extent of what she had uncovered. Holly recounted to investigators how Susan had become increasingly paranoid in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. During one lunch outing, Susan refused to sit with her back to the door, telling Holly that she had to be careful. Jerry's controlling behavior had escalated to the point where he was dropping Susan off and picking her up from social events, never allowing her to drive herself. Susan's behavior became more erratic, and Holly could sense the fear that had taken hold of her friend. Despite her paranoia, Susan still clung to the hope that things could work out with Jerry. She told Holly that she loved him, and there were moments when it seemed like she was in denial about the reality of her situation. But Susan's fear was real, and she confided in Holly that she believed Jerry was capable of violence. She just didn't know how far he would go to protect his secrets. Then, without warning, Susan and Evan vanished. Jerry's story about Susan running off with another man seemed more and more implausible as investigators dug deeper into the case. Susan had confided in Holly that she was planning to leave Jerry, but she had been cautious and methodical about her plans. She would never have disappeared without telling someone, especially not Holly or her mother. Detectives also uncovered troubling evidence that Jerry had gone to great lengths to cover up what had happened. He had replaced the home security system just days after Susan and Evan disappeared. Susan's mother, Linda, had asked Susan why they needed so many cameras around the house. Now, with the security footage erased and the cameras replaced, investigators suspected that Jerry had been trying to hide something. Further complicating the case, cadaver dogs detected traces of human remains near a 55-gallon drum where Jerry had burned trash. Although no bodies were found, the presence of human remains added to the growing belief that Susan and Evan had met a tragic end. As the investigation continued, detectives discovered even more disturbing details about Jerry's past. Not only had he been engaging in affairs with other men, but he had also been advertising himself on an escort website under the alias Jay. On the website, Jerry had posted provocative photos of himself, offering his services to older, wealthy men. Susan had discovered this secret life shortly after they were married. She had confronted Jerry about his activities, but he brushed off her concerns, assuring her that it was all in the past. However, Susan wasn't convinced. She told Holly that she believed Jerry was still involved in his secret life, and she feared what might happen if she ever confronted him fully. Jerry's controlling and manipulative behavior grew worse over time. He began isolating Susan, cutting off her connections to friends and family. By the time she disappeared, Susan felt trapped, unsure of how to escape the dangerous situation she found herself in. In the days leading up to Memorial Day, Susan and Jerry's relationship reached a breaking point. Susan had made it clear that she wasn't going to stay with Jerry, but she was careful not to reveal too much of what she knew. She feared that if Jerry realized she had uncovered the full extent of his double life, he would react violently. On Memorial Day weekend, Susan and Evan were last seen alive. According to Jerry, they left with another man, but no one believed his story. Investigators now believe that something far more sinister had occurred. In the weeks following their disappearance, Jerry's behavior only grew more suspicious. He remodeled the house, burned furniture, and replaced the security cameras. He seemed desperate to erase any trace of Susan and Evan from his life. As investigators pieced together the evidence, they grew more convinced that Jerry was responsible for the deaths of Susan and Evan. The luminol had revealed blood in several areas of the house, and cadaver dogs had detected the presence of human remains near the burn drum. Although they had yet to find bodies, the circumstantial evidence against Jerry was mounting. Detectives also found troubling searches on Jerry's computer. He had looked up how to dispose of a body, how to clean up blood, and other incriminating topics. These searches, combined with the blood evidence, painted a disturbing picture of what had likely happened to Susan and Evan. Despite the growing evidence, Jerry maintained his innocence. When confronted by reporters from Crime Watch Daily, Jerry refused to answer any questions, directing them to his attorney instead. His lawyer claimed that Jerry had nothing to do with Susan and Evan's disappearance and that they had left voluntarily. But few believed that story. For Susan's mother, Linda, the disappearance of her daughter and grandson was a nightmare she could never have imagined. She had always been close to Susan, and the idea that she was gone, likely murdered, was unbearable. Linda had tried to reach out to Susan, had sent letters, had contacted the police, but nothing could have prepared her for the truth. As the investigation dragged on, Linda clung to the hope that justice would be served. She wanted answers, closure, and justice for her daughter and grandson. But without bodies, without a confession, the case remained agonizingly unresolved. Months passed, and investigators continued to work tirelessly to solve the case. They were waiting on DNA results from the blood found in Jerry's home, hoping that the results would provide the final piece of evidence needed to charge Jerry with murder. In the meantime, the story of Susan and Evan's disappearance had captured the attention of the nation. True crime enthusiasts and advocates for justice followed the case closely, hoping that the truth would soon come to light. For investigators, the case was personal. They had become deeply invested in finding justice for Susan and Evan, and they weren't going to stop until they had answers. As of now, the case remains open. Jerry Osborne continues to deny any involvement in Susan and Evan's disappearance, and their bodies have yet to be found. But investigators remain confident that they are on the right track and that, eventually, Jerry will be held accountable for his actions. For Linda, the loss of her daughter and grandson has left a hole in her heart that will never be filled. But she remains determined to see justice served. She knows that Susan and Evan deserve to be remembered, not as victims of a tragic crime, but as a loving mother and son who were taken too soon.